Today we are going to discuss about the Salesforce Apex best practices. We are going to see around 30 Apex best practices. So the first thing is avoid circle inside the loops. So this one everyone is aware about it, but still we make mistakes sometimes. So this is very important. Otherwise we will hit the 100 circle query limit per transaction. So the wrong code is having inside the for loop, right code is having out of the for loop. So the next thing is avoiding hard coding IDs. So we should not hard code the IDs inside the Apex class because different sandbox will have this different record type ID and it can cause the failure when we are moving the changes from the one sandbox to other sandbox. So we need to get to the IDs dynamically. Like for example, this is the code for getting the record type ID. We should not hard code any IDs inside the Apex code. So the next thing is using the custom metadata for configuration. For example, there is a need like we need to configure in the Apex to provide a 10% discount. So that should be in the custom metadata because later client may change from the 10% discount to 12% or 15%. So that time we should be able to make the changes easily without going to the code. So we have different type of custom metadata, hierarchy custom metadata and list custom metadata. In the custom setting, we have the two things. In the custom metadata, it's only list. So now Salesforce is suggesting to use the custom metadata, so we can go with the custom metadata only. But make sure you don't write any configuration values in the code. So the next thing is we need to use the batch Apex for handling the large volume. So if there is any scenario to update the large number of records in the Apex, so instead of directly doing it in the Apex, we can use the batch Apex for doing it. So we don't hit the governor limits for the DML operations. So the next thing is we have future and queueable Apex for asynchronous, simple asynchronous process. So wherever possible, we can go with the queueable because we can chain the job. We can control which will executed next. So in the future, we don't have the control which feature will get executed first and second, but in queueable we have that control. From one queue job, we can schedule another queue job so it can run in the chaining. So the next important thing is avoiding the nested loops. So this we are doing it many times. So whenever the condition that you need to use the two for loops, so you need to thoroughly check if there is any other way possible because nested loops can take the high CPU time and it causes the inefficient code. So you can utilize map instead of using the nested loops. So in your code, mostly it should be only single for loop instead nested loop. So the next thing is minimize the static variables. So static variables retain the values across the transaction. So it keeps the memory. So wherever possible, we need to avoid using the static variable because we need to be careful if you're using the static variable. The same value can be inherited in other places also that can cause the wrong result. So the next important thing is using the Apex talks command. So this we are not doing only, we are just writing the simple command. So we discussed about this in the other calls as well, writing the command. So the command needs to follow the Apex talks format, this at param, at return, all those things. So that is Salesforce official documentation available. You guys can go through it and make sure it's aligning with the Apex talks format. Next thing is using the try catch block for the error handling. So wherever we think error can occur, we need to use the try catch block. On the inside of the block catch block, we can add the system.debug. So it's easy for us debugging. If there is any important thing that needs to be notified to the admin or customer, that time we also need to add the email sending part in the exception block. Next is group DML statements. So we should not use the DML statement inside the for loop or doing it in single. Instead, we need to group the DML statement and execute it at once. It's like SOQL query, avoiding the SOQL inside the for loop. We need to avoid DML statement also. So wherever possible, we need to group and we need to do the DML at once. Like there are scenario we need to update the two different contact at a different point of time. So that time we can just add those contact in the list and we can do the DML at once. So we will not exceed the 150 DML operation limit. Next thing is avoid system.runners outside test classes. System.runners only in the test classes. So even if you're writing outside of the test class, it's not going to work. So don't use that. It doesn't change the context of the user. Next, using the custom exceptions. So if you are going to use the standard exception, it's a simple message, but exceptions, we can add more granularity and readability for error handling. So especially in the integration, you guys always try to use the custom exception. You explore more on this custom exception, how to create the custom exception, extend the custom exception, and use that whenever the exception occurs. So next is avoid hard coding URLs. So whenever we hard code the URL, we need to make sure whether really we need to hard code data, because it can cause the issues when the domain name changes, and it can be different in the sandbox and the production. Even if you are using the third party endpoints or some other URLs, it can change at the different times. Like there is one place in the Lightning Web component, we need to provide one document URL of the external system. So we directly hard coded in the LWC component. So that can create the problem when that document URL changes. We need to update the code. So instead, if we have it configured in the custom label, custom metadata, or if it is a Salesforce related URL, we can also get it dynamically by using this URL.get Salesforce base URL. So next, set a timeout for HTTP callout. So we always needs to make sure to set the timeout. We should not wait till it finishes the complete time and throwing the exception. It's always best practice to add the timeout when you guys are making the call out. And also you need to test how much time each endpoint is taking approximately, and you need to set to the some other limits accordingly. And you may also need to take the decision whether we need to move to the batch class, all those things. So it's always good to know how much time endpoint is taking, and based on that set to the timeout for the each call out. Next thing is reducing the heap size. So sometimes we may hit the heap size limit also. So always we need to make sure we are writing the code in the efficient way so we don't hit the heap size. For example, if we are seeing in the first code, we are adding lot of the things to the list so it can hit the heap size limit error. So basically, wherever possible, you avoid using lot of list, settle map, all those things, and fetch the data only which is relevant, and store the data which is relevant. Like querying the Salesforce record, query only the fields which is needed to process further in the Apex. Don't query all the fields so it can increase the heap size of the transaction. So next thing is using the efficient data structure. So wherever possible, we are already using the like set map, but we need to make the clear decision whether we need to use the list or set for the given use case. For example, in the first, for storing the last name, list is used, but in the second, set is used. So if you are using the list, we are going to store the a lot of data, and if you are using the set, we are going to store the list data because it's unique. So you need to make the decision based on the situation that you are going to use. Like if you are going to store the ID, you can go with the set. So it will not store the duplicate ID, and there is memory, yes, efficient memory usage is there. And it's also related to the heap size. So these are the small things, but you need to take care while writing the code. So when code becomes very much complex, this all will help. So next, database start to save result for the DML operation. So you need to decide whether you need to use the normal DML or database dot save result. So if there is situation that if one record fails, we need to stop all record processing, then we need to use the normal DML. But whatever passes, if we need to make that to pass and others are fine, then we can go with the database dot save result, and all are none to false we can set up. So you guys explore more on it. So whenever coming through the DML thing, you decide whether to go with the normal DML or database dot insert or update or thing. So next, avoid recursive trigger. It's very important. So whenever you are modifying the trigger or writing the new trigger logic, you need to make sure your code handles the recursive and it will execute only one time. Otherwise, it can create many issues. So it can cause the SOQL limit, DML limit, other governed limits as well. We always needs to make sure that our code runs only once per transaction, and use custom labels for user-facing text. So why specifically custom label for user-facing text means whatever the value which is stored in the custom label that can be localized. It means we can show it to the different languages to the user. Like when French user logins, we can show it in the French. Like that, we can change the localization of the custom label values. Next, use compound field for address. So if you need to get it and use all the address values like street, city, zip code, all those things, instead of getting the fields one by one and combining it, we can directly access the compound field. Like instead of fetching account.billing state, we can directly get the account.billing address. Next, use polymorphic SOQL for related objects. So polymorphic fields means in the task object, we have the what ID and the who ID. So what ID, it can store any object ID. So in these types, if you are into the situation to query the task related to the particular account ID and a task related to the particular opportunity, instead of writing the two queries, what we can do, we can write the single query with what or type in account and opportunity. Later, we can further process it. So this reduces one query. So whenever there is situation to handle with the polymorphic fields, make sure to handle it with the single query instead of using the two queries. So the next leverage limit clause for debugging the governor limit. Sometimes we may need to check whether a limit is already exceeded or not. So this situation will occur like you in the single transaction, you have the some code part which is not that much important to execute. So in that time, you can check the limit for the transaction, and based on that, you can decide whether you can proceed with the further execution of that code block or not. So you don't get the exception and complete transaction is not going to fail. So wherever is possible, you can use that. And also it's helpful for debugging the code. You can know, okay, when we reached this Apex class, what was the governor limit? And when transaction reached the next Apex class, what was the governor limit? All those things you can check. This is helpful in the debugging also. When there is a situation like there is complex logic and it's already taking most of the governor limits, you can add this limit and keep it in the system debug. So when new feature you are adding, you can easily debug it. So reducing the heap size by processing in the batches, like even in the batch class, if you are passing the large chunks of records, it's going to have the large heap size. Instead, we can reduce the batch size and process it. All those things we can do it. So in the different code, but it's helpful in the batch Apex mostly. So whenever you are writing the code, you need to think heap size also in mind. Next thing is avoid using non-selective filter. Non-selective filter means it's not equal, less than, or greater than. Instead of you are using like. So wherever you possible, avoid using this like in the SOQL query because it's scanning the entire table and it's affecting the query performance. Even after querying, you can do the processing of the record using the list map, all those things. So wherever possible, avoid using the non-selective query like. So second correct code is using the greater than. So try catch block, we already saw it. So you always keep in mind to use the try catch block wherever it possible. And optimizing the batch Apex with the scope size. So don't always use the 2000 scope size. Wherever possible, you reduce it only because it reduces the heap size, memory consumption, and go batch executes faster. All those things happens. So you need to try and see how is the performance of the batch for the different scope size, and you need to decide accordingly. But the good thing is keep it optimum instead of using the largest scope size. So even trigger, it executes in the batch of 200 only. So next for callout also, we need to have the right exception handling. And using the database.stateful for batch Apex context, like you have the batch class for processing the 2 lakhs records, but you are processing in the small batches. So you need to know at the end how many success, how many is failure, all those things. So that time database.stateful is helpful. So basically it maintain the value between the batches in the same batch job. So we can get the total records, process it in the entire batch jobs at the different batches. So when you use the batch class, you see if you can use the database.stateful also for your use case. So next, avoiding hardcode limit in the bulk operations. So we need to try with the different batch size, right? We are not sure which will be working fine because we may make the call out or we may update the records. Different record update can take the different amount of time. All those things will happen. So we need to keep changing the batch size. So instead of keeping the batch size inside the code, we can declare the integer and we can keep it at the top. So it's easy to modify. You don't need to go into the code and change these kind of constant values. So you can keep it outside the methods or the code block. So it's easy to change it and update, maintain. Okay, so these are the best practices which is we need to use in our day-to-day life. Okay, fine. So thank you everyone.